Today, we'll mainly focus on getting you familiar with creating objects and manipulating them within the space. If you haven't used Cinema 4D before and you've used other or similar CAD software, it does work quite differently because it's also set up obviously for animation, which we won't cover today, but we'll touch upon as we go. Your space should look something a bit like what I have here. I'm going to first go through the palettes that we have stationed around, and then I want to show you the dynamic palettes that we have as well. To do this, I'm going to create and uncreate a few objects just so you have a bit of context for that, because I'll show things in complete isolation. So to do that, I'll start firstly with the palette here on the right. I'm going to start with the second one down just because you'll use it a lot. This is our primitive objects palette. All primitive objects, except for the empty polygon, which is designated by its name, they all have some form of parametric information. And what that means is that if I change, I can type in values to change the size or the way the block or the object is on the screen. So I've created my cube. Again, through this explanation part, kind of create or delete things, but you don't need to. It's more kind of illustrative. So once I have an object created, there's a number of different ways you can edit it, which we'll get to later. But you can see that if I select that object in my attributes palette, which is there for everyone, I can change certain parameters. So I can make it wider, I can make it flatter. So I can change those parameters, and all of the shapes, and we'll do that as we come in, they'll have that kind of variation of control. Text, it's similar, it's basically within that category. And these are essentially spline tools, which are like line tools, which are essentially not parametric. And we'll deal with splines a bit today as well. These are your kind of objects, your kind of object creation palettes. Then these green ones here are more about modification. So again, we'll do this in a bit more detail here, but these are effects that you run across an object, in this case, a primitive object. So subdivision surface, it does what it says on the tin, it takes the surface and it subdivides it, and it creates a series of faceted edges which we can control and manipulate, as an example. Essentially, these nesting objects in group hierarchy is important in Cinema 4D, but basically, generally speaking, green things are modifiers. I'm going to delete that one now. And we also have a series of purple modifiers, which are more like distortions. So we can bend, shear, bulge, and distort objects. So if I very quickly put my deformer in there, should be able to see, should be able to see those purple lines. And let's make the deformation. We should be able to, yeah, so you can see the parameters of the deformer, and then I can get my block to do that. So essentially, one is a modification, series of modifications, the other is a series of deformers. We'll play around with those as we go. And these are slightly more complex series of changes involving fields and formulas. So the way to think about it is that they get more complicated as you go down this list, but the primitive objects that you create exist in blue. Obviously on different versions, they'll be slightly different colors, but that's the kind of way that's set up. Then you have a series of kind of scene, things that control your scene. So again, we will, probably not today, but we'll create a few of these. You have lights. Most of the time when you create new objects in Cinema 4D, they arrive right in the middle. So my light was in the middle of the object, so it wasn't emitting any useful light. So if I move that up, it's then illuminating that surface. It's an omni-light, I can make it a spotlight, so it has a direction, and we can make it face in different ways. Again, we'll definitely cover that in these 5 days, but not today, but just to give you a brief overview first. Cameras are obviously similar to real-world cameras. We always start with the default camera, which we have here at the top. Just want to delete this slide. This default camera that we have here at the top, and we can make more cameras. Obviously, set a scene, set a series of views. We have there's a series of different light types. There's a series of different camera types, etc. And this is the skies and floors for external rendering of our world. So you can have rendering or external creation of our world. Our rendering keys sit up here, and you always have at least these three. These are settings, which again, we'll go through. If I just press the render button, it will attempt to render what we have. It looks pretty similar. It's very basic, but there'll be an immediate render. Because we have a super basic model, it takes less than a second to create. If I, let's say, let's add a different object. If I add a platonic object, put it somewhere else, and I add, say, a sphere as well. Render again. Doesn't get us quite up to a second, but you can see we have a series of objects here. The objects that we have. Hello? Right. The objects that we have here is primitive by. They're very useful. For example, if I fillet this block, you can see it gives it kind of corners and edges, which affects the way that light bounces off it and that kind of thing. For as long as possible, and we'll get into this a bit later today, you'll want to keep objects as primitive before you make them. If you remember, we saw here an empty polygon, because once we make something an empty polygon, we don't have those parametric controls. So it doesn't lose the data we've already given it, but I no longer have the ability to change the size of that curvature. So if I go back a step, and this is a cube again, I can change the size of that fillet while it's parametric. So again, we'll go through all of those different modes, but that's what that does. So yeah, we've got that central render setting there. We can control those. We have a way of rendering to another place. This is an interactive render. So if there are things that we want to change and test on the screen, we can do that before we go to the render view and output that information. That's a little way of doing that. Don't worry, I'm going through this stuff quickly, but we'll obviously cover it as we go, but just like to give an overview. I think the settings are covered already. People online, it might be a little bit different if you have a different version, but we also have a kind of materials palette. So I can add materials, give them a color, and then apply them to an object. We don't always have to create them from scratch. We can also create them, grab them from the library. So if I go all the way up to the top left-hand corner, there's a assets library. So if I search for something like wood, I can scroll down and just give it a second to load. Can bring in different woods elements. So we've got a slightly different one, but that's fine. Yeah, and then that's then applied to my surface. I'm going to close that again. Beside my asset browser, I have my X, Y, and Z constraints. So if you see in the top right-hand corner, we can it always shows us what X, Y, and Z is. Y is always vertical, and X and Y are along your kind of 2D plane. If we want to move objects, we can constrain them using these. If I constrain the X, if I select this object, you can see red is not constrained. So maybe that first. Or not constraining. Come back to that. This is how we move between world and individual coordinates for objects. Again, I'll do that through moving an object. This is quite important because it's how Cinema 4D understands different types of objects. Again, if I quickly make a new cube and I move that to a new position, by default, we should be on this mode where it selects the whole object. But if I deconstruct that cube, it doesn't have those constraints anymore. If I go to points, you should be able to see that I can select individual points and move them to form them. So obviously that changes the relationship between the surfaces of the cube. And then I can also select individual surfaces and move those, that deformation, and also edges. So these edges if I do a rotation, if I move as edge, you can see that's also a kind of form. So there's ways to control that and to manipulate that as you want. That's generality there. If I rotate out, there are a series of kind of navigation and rotation tools. which I'll run through once you make an object which we're all going to manipulate. And also these presets I'll speak about then. These are also about locking. So a lot of time when people are first using Cinema 4D, they find that locking objects is a little bit of an issue. So this magnet icon allows you to lock different objects. So I'll come back to that. And then just very briefly, if we go to the bottom, I made that a little bigger for now, we have timeline. So we won't be doing anything with the timeline today, but just to make you aware of it, we can create animations very quickly. What we have is 90 frames. We can increase that or decrease that. And by default, I think we set it like 30 frames a second, which we can also change. And we can move objects and set anchors at different markers. So that's what that's about. This icon here gives us more control over the interface. I'll come to that later. And I think, okay, so all of these on the left are part of our dynamic controls. So essentially, whenever you draw or edit something for the first time, it will park a dynamic control there. There's a way of manipulating that as well. We can call out different controls and park them, but that's basically what that does. So that's just a very kind of quick overview of the controls that sit around. They all exist as a series of windows or palettes. So if we go to window, we can always open them and close them there. And probably they also exist as drop-down menus here. So sometimes I'll go to the drop-down instead of the icon, but it's a kind of a duplication of information. And but the other important thing to know is that we have these different, if you like, workspaces for focusing on the different things that Cinema 4D does. The names are pretty kind of self-explanatory. For what we're going to do today, we really want to be on, should we actually just do one called standards, but we can be on model. Should have a new one. Standard. For some reason, standard was hiding in the plus. So yeah, so if everyone's on standard, we'll have access to the same information. Sometimes you might have startup as well, which people get confused with standard, but generally speaking, you want to be on standard. Okay, so that's just a kind of quick rip through kind of what's on the screen. If any of your palettes are different, either go to window and palettes, or you can ask me. I can show you how to turn on different palettes. Okay, so if I delete information here, and I'll start with creating a queue and just navigating around that. Yeah, it's a thing that we can all do. So should be on this icon here, our model icon. Just if you're not, strange things will happen. And if you hold down on the cube icon, it will create a cube, and that cube will be 200 centimeters. A lot of time people want to change the units because they're used to working in meters or millimeters. You can just do that by going to edit and preferences, and it should open up a dialog box. And then under preferences, about a third of the way down, you've got units, and we can change that. I personally prefer to be in millimeters, but pick whatever units that you prefer. And then so, okay. So now it just says 2000 rather than 200. Whenever you create a new object, it goes straight away to your object palette here. It comes with this icon, which is, it's called a font tag, but essentially it's what gives your object visibility to different types of camera and light. It's not really a thing that you need to worry about. But sometimes if you open an existing file or something is wrong, you won't have that tag and your objects won't be visible. So it's just a thing to mark. After this break line, everything that's here is information about your object, whatever the object is. So yeah, we've created that under attributes. Object attributes, we want to change the size of this. So I'm going to make this a meter square rather than 1,000. So I'm just typing and tabbing through, and that allows me to, it's a bit quicker. We can, so whenever you have an object, and it's selected. You know it's selected because you have this orange selection ring around it. It has an origin, which is at the center. Now, there are ways to change this origin, but it's important to note at the beginning it's at the center. I can change the size of it, not just by typing, but by pulling on these yellow toggles. Obviously, as I do that, you should be able to see the size, the X, because I'm changing the X-axis, the size of the X-axis running larger and smaller. The yellow marker is between or close to the axis marker, the color, these three, green, blue, and red. So you just need to make sure that you're zoomed in and out enough to be able to edit that the way that you need it to be. Zooming, there's a couple ways of zooming, but if you have a mouse, it's just that middle wheel on your mouse that allows you to zoom in and out. I'll do the other edit modes in a second. Moving it by this point, you can see that it doesn't give you any, it does give you some control, but you end up with these fractions. So in general, better type because it gives you, the fractions don't really cause a problem for the software, but if you have lots of things which are in decimal fractions, it's hard to navigate what you're doing. Okay, I'm going to add another object, and then I'm going to do a little bit with orientation. So I'm going to go back to the cube icon. This time I'm going to make a cone. You can see it, cone. And I'm just going to move that cone so that it is above my cube. If I move it without holding anything, it moves it randomly. You can see the numbers in the middle of the screen changing. If you hold down Shift, it locks to preset divisions. So for now, I'm just going to eyeball it and try and place it on top of my brick, place my cone on top of my brick. There is a way we can check that in a second, but the main thing is holding down Shift gives you a kind of control over that data. So I'm going to make a new object now just to explain to you how those units work, so you don't need to make this object. So you can see it's moving in increments of 50 minute increments. And that's set by what's called our modes, modeling settings. And then we have our snap and this thing called quantizing. So it's by default on snap. The snap radius is important because it's basically telling us how far away we need to be before it snaps to those. And then quantize is the size. So you can see that our move size is 50 millimeters. Bring that up a bit. Our move size is 50 millimeters. You can change it if you want, but that's what it's automatically snapping to. Again, we will change it in future sessions, so we can come back to these settings. Often with where things live, that is settings, they're easy to forget, but we'll go back and forth with them. So I'm not going to change it for now, but this is where it lives. Delete that block. So I placed this object on top of this one, but I want to check that it's in the right place. So there's a couple of things we can do. The first is if you hold down 3, it allows you to essentially orbit as you move your mouse. So hold down 3, and then you can move around and see where things sit. And you'll be doing that quite often. We were using the circle to zoom in and out. You can also do that with holding down number 2 and clicking and moving your mouse. That should allow you to zoom in and out. And then the last one is number 1. If you hold down 1, you can basically pan and move things from side to side. So between those 3 buttons, you have a kind of dexterity. I'll keep mentioning them as we move around and do different things. The other thing that we want to be able to do is look at different views. So in our default view, we're obviously in 3D. If I go to the top left-hand corner above the XYZ and click there, it'll give us top, front, and right view. So generally speaking, we'll be in 3D most of the time, but we can jump between these different views to check things, to locate things. Obviously, sometimes it's better to work in a different view. They all work simultaneously. So if I select this object, I mean, it is in the right place, but if it wasn't, I can hold down Shift. Oops, I can hold down Shift and I can move it to where I want it to be. If we have a division which isn't divisible 50, we can move an object by as much as you want it to and get it to snap to other objects. If you remember, I just ran through at the top, the snap button, if that's turned on, when I move this object, it should snap to other objects. By shift, should be snapping to that other object. You'll notice it snapping on or off as you move things. Okay, so I'm going to go to get the view that I want. You can either put your mouse in that view and then click on the wheel, press the wheel, and it will pick that view. Or you can just click again on the scale, the multiple view button to get into different views.